Hi, everybody. This is Mark. Welcome to another lecture for Politics of Development. There's an idea in international relations that suggests that stability in world order is contingent on a stable balance of power, particularly between great powers, and a sense that political authority, both domestically as well as internationally, is legitimate. Right? World order depends on a balance of power and legitimacy. And perhaps the rise and the contemporary growth of BRICS represents the challenge faced with world order today, as both representing these disturbances to the balance of power with these powerful emerging economies, but also it perhaps represents a legitimacy crisis in the heart of the rules-based international order, and a reflection to one extent or another on the legitimacy crisis facing international development efforts. In 2001, it was a Goldman Sachs analyst, Jim O'Neill, who was told to come up with an idea for a report on a major transition happening in the world economy. And so he came up with the idea of the BRICS, of these four countries that were set to eventually really shift and change the tectonic plates of the world economy. And what's amazing is that then this report, I mean, they say like life can imitate art. Well, life imitated the musings of a Goldman Sachs analyst, because it was just a few years later in 2006 when the foreign ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, and China began to meet fairly informally. Just a few years later, in 2009, the heads of state of those four countries began to have their official formal summits each year. In December of 2010, in the context actually of the Copenhagen Accord, the Conference of Parties held in Denmark, that was at first it was meant to be the successor to the third Conference of Parties, the Kyoto Protocol. But it really didn't go very well. There were these incredible tensions between the West and the rest on a lot of issues. This was the first year of Barack Obama's presidency. He really wanted to try to broker a grand bargain to have a fully fledged agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It ended up floundering into a statement that was about 2.5 pages long, which basically noted that climate change is really significant, but it said that states are going to have to figure this out on their own. And it was in the context of these really deep divides between the European Union and the United States and many countries in the global South, where South Africa then joined in with the BRICS, and the lowercase s became a full-fledged uppercase S. In Cannes in 2011, it's began the norm of having the BRICS meet with before the G20. So it would line up with the G20. All of these countries are G20 states, including South Africa. And so the G20 would have a sub-form, a pre-meeting for the BRICS countries. And just in August of 2023, and it's just remarkable how quickly these dynamics can happen, BRICS has expanded its membership to include some perhaps fairly obvious countries that may not be too surprising, such as Iran comes to mind, a country that has a very conflictual and tense relationship with much of the rules-based international order. Ethiopia, perhaps not terribly surprising, because of the really close relationship between Ethiopia and China. Ethiopia is one of the closest international friends that China has. But some of these other ones are fairly surprising. Argentina, for instance, a country whose foreign policy has moved closer to China, but is also one that has had quite the relationship with international financial institutions. And Saudi and Egypt and the UAE, right? These three countries in the Middle East that have had a very close relationship with the United States and have for decades, Egypt being one of the largest recipients of American aid of any country in the world. Saudi, another country which to one extent or another has its destiny bound with the US, and the UAE often positioning itself as this force of modernization in the Middle East. And these countries have now joined BRICS. In the statement on announcing the expansion of BRICS at the end of the summer of 2023, Xi Jinping really peppered throughout his speech denouncements of what he calls US hegemony in world order. And he really was challenging the international financial institutions, discrediting them, and saying that world order is shifting. Here's a little visualization of the BRICS expansion, which notes that these countries, with the new countries that have come in, now boost the BRICS' share of global GDP to almost 30%. It also boosts the share of the world's population to almost 50%, 46%. It boosts oil production to 43%, and the export of goods, 25% of the global export of goods. And a really important dynamic to keep in mind, too, from the summer of 2023 is that it also has resulted in a number of other countries applying for membership. That BRICS is perhaps not done expanding yet, such as in cases of Cuba. You can see Honduras in Central America, Venezuela, Bolivia, and then there's also Belarus, which is, of course, very close to Russia, Mongolia, another state very close to Russia. But there's also Algeria and Senegal. Senegal is a really interesting one, too, because Senegal is one of the few countries in Africa during the 1980s and 1990s debt crisis that made a real attempt to implement the International Monetary Fund and World Bank cross-conditionality reforms. But Senegal is interested in joining BRICS, one of the former countries that attempted those reforms. Nigeria, Africa's largest country by population and by the size of its economy, expressing its interest. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, that massive country in Central Africa, bordering the Great Lakes region, that has been the subject to just an unending conflict since the Second Congo War. And in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, a country that had just formalized a security deal with the United States right around the same time, has also expressed its interest. Thailand, another country which is extraordinarily surprising and interesting, given Thailand's really close relationship to the United States, to the rules-based international order, and the fourth largest country in the world, the third largest democracy, Indonesia, as well, as being very interested in pursuing a BRICS membership. And so there is this expansion happening. It is showing the widespread legitimacy of BRICS for a number of countries throughout the global south. And one of these big questions is, to what extent is that growing legitimacy of the BRICS club, does that show us something about a legitimacy crisis occurring for world order more broadly. And there's two fairly long chapters from a recent book from Oxford University Press by three scholars from the US on the motives of BRICS and whether or not it has the capabilities for increasing influence. And thematically, they're thinking about power, right? To what extent does BRICS have the power to shape the environment of the world economy? And so they note that in traditional international relations and in the international political economy subdiscipline, there's relational power and there's structural power. Relational power is the power that we often think about in political science courses. Power can be hard power, so the power to coerce, either through economic incentives or through diplomatic type pressures. And it also includes a soft power as well, the ability of a great power to provide incentives to shape the attractiveness of that country in a way to encourage societies and governments from around the world to align what they want for their country to what the other countries may want. And so that's seen as relational, right? It's a power over others or a power to influence the decisions of others. And so it's based on influence, but also on autonomy, whether a country has the ability to rebuff that relational power from other countries. And this is really where a lot of the discussion on power is centered in international relations. But there's another formulation of it too, one that is most often referenced to one of the founders of international political economy, a scholar by the name of Susan Strange. She really is one of the founding people in IPE. And in a number of her work, such as in The Retreat of the State, she presents an idea of structural power. And she defines structural power as the shaping and the determination of structures of the global political economy to decide how things shall be done and the power to shape frameworks within which states relate to each other. So it's seen as something very broad, the structural power. It's the creation of the norms or shared expectations of the international political economy, of the rules, of the institutions, of the procedures of diplomatic relations between countries. And she imagined it in her work as a four-sided pyramid. And so one face of the pyramid is that of security. And the authors consider the extent to which BRICS has this security power, structural power within it. And they largely discount this. They note that there are some real geopolitical tensions, that these countries are not bound to each other's security in the same way that the G7 is, right? The G7 consists of a number of NATO countries, as well as Japan, with whom the United States has ultimate security agreements with. And she says they say that it's not really the case when it comes to BRICS. You really can't imagine that, primarily because you have the tensions between India and China that have existed for a long time, especially since 1962, when China soundly defeated India in a border war, which resulted in China conquering disputed territory in the Himalayas. And we saw this play out again in more recent years with another border skirmish between those two great powers. India, for instance, is even referenced as being part of a Quad, which is a security arrangement in the Indo-Pacific with the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, building closer relations in a fairly obvious bid to have a defense structure against China. So the security is pretty thin. You could even put Russia into this as well, where Russia, as the most revisionist of all the countries within BRICS, meaning it is the one that is most hostile to the existing rules-based international order and most willing to have a more offensive orientation to challenge it, such as with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then the war unleashed on Ukraine in February of 2022. There's also a knowledge face to structural power in international relations. So this is how we think about world order, what it ought to look like. And we can see, especially in the context of development from earlier in our course, that John Rapley book, for instance, Rapley chronicles a genealogy of thinking about development over the decades and how these paradigms, though they never disappear, that they do shift to a certain extent, where certain paradigms which are latent for a while may become dominant, but much of it is unsettled. But these paradigms have had an effect on how international financial institutions and how donor countries and borrower countries try to make sense of the pathways for development. And so knowledge is a structural component to it. Production is as well. So the harnessing of industry, which may shift power. It's one of those debates that are occurring in the so-called post-industrial societies of the West, and whether or not these countries are, such as the United States, are objectively less powerful, as they have offshored much industry to other low labor jurisdictions. But the real focus for Cynthia Roberts, Leslie Amiro, and Sori Katada is financial power. This is the crux of it. It was sometimes in IPE. I even think it was Susan Strange who once wrote this, that finance calls the tune, right? Finance is a real source of structural power in the world today. And so what these three scholars are really curious about is whether or not the BRICS represents this growing financial power. And they say that there might be a third element to relational power and structural power, and that is relative capabilities. And so they sound a little bit more like traditional realists in the sense that it's about the relative capabilities of the BRICS countries that plays a serious role in the functioning of structural power. Countries will only have structural power, such as these BRICS countries, if it's seen that they have relative capabilities. The expansion of BRICS does seem to indicate exactly that. And there is a major shift in the economic center of gravity that has occurred with the rise of the BRICS countries, perhaps an unprecedented shift not seen since 1944 in the Bretton Woods conference that occurred in New Hampshire, where the foundations of world order were laid. So it presents some questions to us. What are the sources of motivation for BRICS? Why would a country such as Saudi or Argentina or South Africa, for that matter, be motivated to join BRICS? Well, for one, in terms of relative capabilities, emerging markets constitute a far larger share of the global market than they had in a long time. It's what we talked about before in the very first class as the idea of the Great Convergence. In 1990, the G7 was about 60% of the world economy. And by 2020, it was, just over 30%. The share of the global their share of the global economy was effectively cut in half. In 1980, only the Soviet Union had a larger economy than Canada of all these would-be BRICS countries. In 2023, 3 BRICS countries had a larger economy than Canada, and neither of them was Russia. Canada has a slightly larger economy than Russia, which is why the late senator from Arizona and presidential hopeful John McCain would quip that Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country. But in 2023, not only China and India are larger than Canada by some serious orders of magnitude, but Brazil as well had become larger than Canada. Another point they make too, and so this really speaks to the relative power, the changes in the balance of power that's going to create a center of gravity. And I think that the allegory is maybe useful in a way, because remember, I take you back to high school physics, that gravity is the effect of mass on space and time. So the more massive an object, it bends the space-time continuum towards it, right? Capturing other objects and bringing it into its orbit, right? And so there's this attractive force that gravity carries with it through the space-time continuum, bringing it to it. And so this becomes attractive for other countries in the orbit, right? Countries like that aren't nearly as powerful, like South Africa or Ethiopia. Another point they make is that you have to appreciate that for the BRICS countries, that they are inspired or sensitive to the G7. And so what they're doing here is they're creating their own club, much like the G7 is this highly exclusive club. Keep in mind too that we looked at the context of international development tensions was one of the main causes of how the G5 and then the G7 came together. And this is in some ways a reaction to it, a frustration of how the United States and certain key allies will attempt to make important economic considerations in the context of an exclusive club. Another point they make is that not all are equal in BRICS. China has a larger economy than all of these other countries put together times two, basically. So it is anchored by China. It revolves around China's intent to sustain BRICS and then the motivations that these other countries have of having an economic interdependence with China, but also attempting to establish what we would call hegemonic bargains. Just as how the rules-based international order from Bretton Woods on was based on hegemonic bargains with the United States. So other countries around the world, they may be reluctant about the structural power the United States has in the Bretton Woods institutions, but the US is, in the rules-based international order, agreeing at least to partially restrain itself, to operate under some more cautious principles in order to maintain the legitimacy of that rules-based international order, though at times it would certainly defy it when its will was strong enough, such as with the Vietnam War or the Iraq War. But this is a hegemonic bargain at the heart of the rules-based international order. It was certainly a motivation for Canada on why it wanted to see US foreign policy more grounded in these formal institutions of diplomacy, like the UN or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank and these other groups. And this might be true as well for the other countries with respect to China, to try to pin it into some limited hegemonic bargains, which seems to have achieved a certain degree of success, because as the authors note, China is revisionist in terms of not entirely accepting this current status quo, but its approach, at least to this point, has been fairly modest in its challenges to the rules-based international order. On security, though, they're not going to have a collective security because of those India-China tensions and because of how Russian foreign policy is really the exception rather than the norm relative to the others. there is this one common link between them all on wanting regional influence. So they may not sign an Article 5 agreement like what exists in NATO, but they all do have expectations of a regional influence. China and India does represent a major fissure, though, right? This is a flashpoint in it because of these questions of jurisdiction and boundaries, right? For instance, some in India and in the West talk about the region as the Indo-Pacific, right? Linking India to the broader Asia-Pacific, a term which Xi Jinping, for instance, has scoffed at times, preferring instead the Asia-Pacific name. The US dollar in its place in the world is another source of tension for a number of countries, and the different countries of BRICS share these reservations on the influence and power that the US has within that rules-based international order, as long as the dollar is the most important reserve currency in the world. For instance, the US dollar is used for 43% of cross-border payments on the SWIFT network, which is essentially the international network of how banks talk to each other. Russia basically got kicked out of the SWIFT network because of the war in Ukraine. They were warned that it would happen after the annexation of Crimea, and President Dmitry Medvedev, president for a brief period of time on behest of Vladimir Putin, he even warned about basically a nuclear Armageddon if Russia was completely excluded from SWIFT. 86% of trade finance based on the US dollar. And though the three scholars here, they really note the rise of relative power, of structural power of the BRICS, they don't actually think that the structural power in the area of finance is enough to truly challenge the existing world order because of the lack of openness of their currencies. Right? When we look at the foreign investment openness and trade openness, and most critically, capital account liberalization. So this is the extent to which they allow their currency to be freely convertible in global markets. Britain at 0.8, the US at 0.82, with Germany at 0.82, Japan at 0.9, France at 0.95. When it comes to the BRICS countries, right, China is the anchor to it all, and they are reluctant to liberalize their capital accounts. Right, for China, it's 0.09. Brazil is fairly high. Russia, for a time before the invasion of Ukraine, was also significantly high. Some of these countries make no apologies for the discrimination against foreign investors, such as Brazil and China, right? Where they're not claiming to create a non-discriminatory environment whatsoever. And foreign investment openness is also, really, really quite low for Russia, as fairly low for China too, at 0.3. China is unwilling to open up its capital accounts entirely because of the financial crises that have afflicted the post-Cold War environment. Their perspective, at least the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, is that the Asian financial crisis, which started in Thailand in 1996 and spread to hit other major economies of the Asia Pacific like Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia. In fact, one World Bank report said that the Asian financial crisis in Indonesia represented maybe the worst developmental setback of any country outside of a war zone since World War II came to an end. Their perspective was that followed the capital account liberalization. Opening up your currency to global forces means opening it up to speculators who will potentially destabilize it. Another fear that the Chinese Communist Party has is that they worry that this would, if the redback, right, the yuan, and redback is like a nickname for the Chinese currency based on the US dollar being nicknamed the greenback. Well, the fear in the investor world in China is that if the redback becomes open and freely convertible, then there's going to see a dramatic exodus of the redback from China, as people across the country will look to purchase other currencies. And so this is the major reason why the financial structural power of the BRICS has not been complete. They provide 6 propositions on why it is, or how it is, that BRICS will cooperate more closely amongst itself. This is a picture of the new development bank, which is effectively the BRICS headquarters in Shanghai. And one of the major reasons for BRICS cooperation is to signal dissatisfaction with the existing world order. And you really think that in this era where the current world order is, crumbling, probably at best it's crumbling, that the expansion of BRICS to include Argentina especially, but also Saudi Arabia and others, is to signal dissatisfaction with the status quo, at least to a certain degree. And BRICS really gained momentum after the 2008 global financial crisis, where the Chinese Communist Party really had this new narrative of believing that it shows that the Americans really don't know what they're doing as the masters of the financial world, and to not trust them, that they could in fact bring down their economy if they were to deregulate and liberalize in a way similar to the Americans exposing themselves to all kinds of crazy toxic assets, like in the US leading up to 2008, with collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps. Another motivating factor is when there are perceptions of sovereignty threats. Right? These countries tend to be the sovereignty hawks of the world, those who believe that the foundation of world order from the founding of the UN on is the recognition of state sovereignty. For the UN, it's more of a riddle. It's both an affirmation of the sovereignty of the state, but also an aspiration on the dignity that ought to be afforded to individuals, and that countries need to be restrained in their actions towards their own public as well as to other countries. For the BRICS countries, this is not as powerfully accepted, right? The aspirational side. Some of these countries are really, they see world order as based on that sovereignty principle most of all. And a lot of the context for that are these feelings of, well, American and European interventions around the world, the interventions of international financial institutions to not simply provide a loan to prevent a balance of payments crisis, but instead to attach all kinds of restrictions on it. And so, there's like a position that they're coming from that informs their sovereignty positions, though it is more complicated for some of these BRICS countries, right? South Africa, for instance, though their democratic institutions have come under duress in recent years, there is still this general ideal that South Africa has of promoting democracy around the world, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. Another motivating force on why there's greater cooperation amongst the BRICS countries is to provide carrots to their own region, such as with the picture here of the new developmental bank. It's meant to free up some opportunities for these great powers to appear benevolent to their regions, to facilitate cooperation amongst them, and to distribute this banquet of goods upon the more impoverished neighbors, which of course all of these countries are surrounded by some deeply impoverished neighbors. And this is where the anchoring with China is so important as the main benefactor to the New Development Bank and the main financial backer of BRICS investments around the world. Domestic audiences are another key one. This BRICS generally flies very well in the more nationalist and populist circles of these different countries. And China is motivated to support BRICS when they can use BRICS as a cover of sorts to mask what could otherwise be seen as their own offensive ambitions. And for the rest of the countries, as we noted before, it represents an opportunity to bind China into hegemonic bargains of an international organization. Let's think about the perspectives from the different capitals. Here's Xi Jinping with a smile on his face. I had it from a recent BRICS conference. You don't really see him smiling too much at international summits these days. China actually sent the second largest delegation to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The caveat being is that it was a delegation representing the Kuomintang, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's group of Chinese, which then goes on to lose the Chinese Civil War, and it's pushed back into Taiwan. China is outside of the international economic order from 1949, when it is victorious, throughout the 1950s with the Korean War and the shelling of Taiwanese islands, and then the Great Leap Forward, which results in famine, followed by a cultural revolution of the 1960s of a state terror on China. But starting in the early and mid 1970s, China begins to diplomatically connect with countries such as Canada under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The foundations are laid with the Nixon administration in the United States. And Mao dies. Eventually, a formerly banned figure, Deng Xiaoping, begins to institute major reforms in China in 1978 and 1979, which he famously described as China needing to hide your capabilities and to bide your time, to engage with the world so that China can grow and prosper and rise. And then as it becomes a great power, that's when the calculus begins to change. And so China today sees itself, understands itself acutely as a great power, right? As it's a return to form for China. It is the middle kingdom, right, of all under heaven. And it expects that it will shape global governance and to also be a leader of the global South. At one point, China was one of the most impoverished countries in the world, such as during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, right? And not that many decades ago, and now is one of, if not one of the two most powerful countries in the world. China had also experienced some bruising encounters with international financial institutions as it joined this world order. For instance, the International Monetary Fund would often chastise China for its savings glut. So its attempt to try to keep money into savings, which the IMF didn't like. And the Chinese Communist Party, for their part, they noted that while it's a duty of the IMF to perform surveillance of the financial activities of different countries, they were frustrated in saying, well, why aren't you saying anything about the United States? You chastise us for our current account surpluses with other countries. What about when the United States was allowing for risky financial deregulation of Wall Street, of the deregulation of banks that take depositors' checks? That it was an unfair system of pointing out the flaws of China as they saw it, but not saying the same thing for the US or European countries. It gives China too an opportunity to earn prestige, right? This is something that great powers seek. Even middle powers seek prestige, right? So even you can look at the governments of Justin Trudeau and note that there's a seeking of prestige that comes with their foreign policy. And it's certainly true for the second largest economy in the world, that it's looking for these opportunities to enhance its status. And when met with a number of other countries that have similar reservations on world order, and to be that hegemon, right, to be the great power where they are seeking after hegemonic bargains, it's extremely attractive. And there's also, as the authors note, sensitivity that the Chinese Communist Party has about those efforts to curtail China's rise, right, to prevent it from becoming as powerful, as influential as it sees its birthright and destiny. Russia is another one worth commenting on, because Russia is in some ways the exception here, that even in Broken Bricks, that Sharma, he says that Russia is only a part of BRICS because it just wouldn't work right if you didn't have the R in the acronym, because its inclinations are to really push the BRICS into more vehemently anti-Western club in a way that none of the other BRICS members are that comfortable with. They want to challenge the system and to reform it, but Russia, as perhaps the strongest sovereignty hawk with the strongest compulsions for revisionism, would take a lot further. And it had a complicated history after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Russia underwent some terrible financial crises that impoverished the country, that reduced the life expectancy in the country. Russia, though, the populist nationalist narratives blamed the International Monetary Fund for so much of the misery caused by Russian society. The three scholars here do note that the International Monetary Fund was pressured by the Clinton administration to basically just fund Russia and to prevent a complete bankruptcy, because what they feared was a return of a communist party to power, or within Yeltsin's own government, perhaps an extremely nationalistic type power would emerge. And so, but Russia still never got through this very effectively. They talk a little bit in this part of the chapter of the GKOs, which is basically Russia's debt that it was selling to international investors, where Russia was expected to pay these obscene rates of return interest payments of like 40% on the GKOs, and the currency was practically useless. And it really struggled quite mightily. And for better or for worse, Russian nationalist rhetoric really targeted the International Monetary Fund as the cause of this hardship. Of course, too, with the annexation of Crimea, Russia was ejected from the G8. Right? The G8 doesn't exist anymore with the G7. They were threatened to be evicted from the SWIFT currency exchange system, trade system. And then with the war in Ukraine, they were ejected from it. They lost their market access to a number of European countries, such as Germany, which under Angela Merkel had been practicing an Ostpolitik, or politics of the East, to think that, okay, we do trade with Russia, we'll then socialize Russia into a European system. And of course, what happens is that they won't accept countries within its near abroad as being a part of a European international diplomatic order. And so Europe sees the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and then Europe's largest war since World War II. And the ambition, though, that Putin seems to have had, at least up until this is completely wrecked with the war with the annexation of Crimea was the notion of a Eurasian Union, where Russia, which would facilitate this Eurasia economic trading union from Vladivostok right all the way to Lisbon, and Russia would facilitate it all. The war in Ukraine changes that considerably. India, right, they are motivated, it said here, by autonomy as well as by a commitment to multipolarity. So I'm just going to pause for a second. For India, they had been, ever since, though they're proud of their presence at Bretton Woods, much like Brazil is to this day, they always understood themselves as the oppressed and the downtrodden within the rules-based international order, and deeply uncomfortable with US power and influence over that system. India, since the time of Nehru, was a major supporter of the non-aligned movement, and more often than not pursued a courtship with the Soviet Union, such as with Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, who signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. And so today, though, India is motivated quite strikingly by the quest for multipolarity as a way. They don't want to see a bipolar world order emerge of the United States and China. Instead, they want to see a truly multipolar world where India's power and influence is recognized by those two superpowers. They also want more influence within those international financial institutions. And they have had this troubled relationship with the rules-based international order, such as doing trade with a number of countries that are seen as a rogue state at one point or another. For instance, for a number of years, 60% of India's oil and gas imports were coming from Iran during a time when Iran was sanctioned from participating in the SWIFT system of transactions. And so India would have to pay for its oil and gas from Iran outside of the SWIFT system, and is doing something similar to that, because since the invasion of Ukraine, maybe as much as 85% of India's oil and gas is now coming from Russia. And so India is a country that has, in recent years, as well as further into the past, been more willing to interact with these pariah states than a number of countries would appreciate. Within India too, there is often, at least for Modi, for instance, in the BJP, there's this tendency to really push back against what they see as like the neo-colonialism or imperialism of the West. Not too long ago, when Justin Trudeau mentioned to the press that he had talked to Modi about the Indian government being responsible perhaps for an extrajudicial assassination of an activist in BC advocating for the secession of Khalistan from India. Modi really, really got enraged about this, and denounced Trudeau, denounced Canada, made it put Indians getting Canadian visas, basically helped put that on ice, was trying to put pressure against Indian students from studying in Canada. And, this really was an example of that BJP narrative that Modi often relies on, of seeing India as being treated as an inferior country, right? The audacity of a Canadian prime minister to allege, without releasing conclusive evidence to the world, that the Indian government was actually responsible for this assassination. Another example they show in their article here is after the global financial crisis in 2010, the UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown proposed the Tobin tax reforms, named after an economist, Tobin. And the idea of this was that financial transactions like buying stocks would require an investor to pay a small tax, and the small taxes would then, over the years, it would accumulate into a very big fund, and that would be the fund used to bail out banks and financial institutions when the next financial crisis happens. And India didn't like the idea of that. They really thought that, hey, this is basically just a way of punishing the smaller stock markets out there and to pay for the imprudent financial deregulation of other countries. Canada, for its part, under Prime Minister Harper, also opposed the Tobin tax and instead called for just better regulatory reform. And as before noted, India is really in this unique position in BRICS because it stands to have the greatest geopolitical tension with China. Perhaps this is a reason why India is very interested in admitting countries such as Thailand and especially Vietnam and Indonesia into the BRICS framework, to other, especially Vietnam and Indonesia, who have these long-standing irreconcilable disputes with China over the South China Sea. Brazil is next here. Here is Lula with Xi Jinping at a recent conference where Lula wanted to talk to Xi about the problem of the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world. Brazil had been wary of international financial institutions for a time. In the 1980s. Brazil was one of the countries hit the hardest by the debt crisis. About 50% of all Brazilian export revenue was being paid just to service the debt. That means to pay the interest on the debt, not even to pay off the debt. And political culture has lingering resentments against the International Monetary Fund for the conditionalities imposed on Brazil. But Brazil is also influenced as well by countries in South America, as well as in Central America, much smaller countries, which have seen themselves directly impacted by international financial institution interventions. The other really big economy in South America, Argentina, has also had a very complicated relationship with its debt and with international financial institutions. And it said that the Brazilian elites, they see what has happened with Argentina, and they really feel as if this is an example of US bullying, the US throwing its weight around the Americas and making things unnecessarily hard for a country like Argentina. And Brazil worries that, especially with its own financial challenges, which have existed even before COVID, it started a few years before COVID for Brazil, that this could happen to them, that they might actually see their quality of life really negatively impact potentially by Washington. Another example is how an activist judge in the New York district basically passed this one ruling that would sanction American companies, from doing business in Argentina. And this is one of those fears that Brazil has, that the US at multiple levels has the ability to throw its weight around the Americas. Though it has had generally positive relations with the US, it's more about the perceptions that Brazil has of the US interacting with other countries. But it also does feel dismissed by Washington, that Brazil's status as another great power of the Americas is not really acknowledged by the US. And the US has certainly never supported the attempts of Brazil to become a permanent member on the UN Security Council. Brazil was fairly horrified by the events in 2011 surrounding the intervention in Libya, which was the first and I think probably the last time the responsibility to protect will ever be invoked by the UN Security Council. with Gaddafi having his forces advance on Benghazi during the Arab Spring, and with Gaddafi giving really unhinged speeches about murdering people, echoing the Rwandan genocide, talking about defeating them in their closets and under their beds and calling them cockroaches and rats. What happened is the UN Security Council passed a resolution 1973 after the Arab League asked Russia and China to not veto the resolution. But it became a complicated mission right away, where NATO was then authorized to intervene and to stop what it saw as a potential ethnic cleansing that was going to happen. But it wasn't even sure whether the point of the mission was to overthrow the Gaddafi regime or simply to get its military to stand down. The bombing, of course, destabilizes the regime. Gaddafi attempts to flee, is found and is brutally murdered, and also an extrajudicial killing. And Libya sinks into a state of anarchy where it is trapped for over a decade. And for instance, in the aftermath of the intervention, Brazil ruffled some Western feathers by proposing a modified R2P, not responsibility to protect, but an RFP, the responsibility for protection, meaning that the doctrine of the UN must be to create stability in any region where there is intervention. South Africa, the fifth member of the traditional BRICS, which was the latecomer to the party in December of 2010. It is not the largest country in Africa, that's Nigeria, but it does have the largest industrial base. It has either the second or third largest economy in the country, depending on purchasing price parity, which makes Egypt number 2. And it's sometimes said that South Africa is perhaps similarly misplaced in BRICS, whereas for Russia, they're more revisionist than the rest of the BRICS countries are. For South Africa, the issue is more on the other end of the spectrum, where they're the least revisionist of all the BRICS members. It hasn't really seen BRICS as entirely high in the foreign policy agenda, that this is maybe that point is less true today, after, for instance, Moscow had agreed to pay for a major African Union headquarters, for instance, in South Africa. It was believed at the time that the inclusion of South Africa into BRICS really came more from the role of leadership and the particularities of Jacob Zuma as president of South Africa, who had this fiery populist way about him. And so he was eager to try to find a way to put South Africa on the world agenda, and was able to accomplish this through a relationship with these other BRICS countries. And for South Africa, it notes that there is an anti-capitalist populism that you at least heard with Zuma, for instance, but also this attempt to woo investment. And that investment, right, from South Africa's perspective, it is more lucrative with China and with Russia than it is from Europe or from the United States. The article that we had for this set of readings is one by Sharma from Foreign Affairs from over a decade ago on broken BRICS. And so in some ways, I think maybe it's a little bit dated, but in other ways, you wonder, is there a certain kind of truth to it, even granted with the expansion of BRICS? So he notes that idea of the great convergence of less developed countries converging with the more developed ones is often overstated, that you still don't really have that many countries getting out of the middle income trap. So the intensely poor countries can get up to middle income status, but they can't really achieve that high income status. He notes that since 1950, only 1/3 of countries could sustain 5% growth per decade. Less than 25% could sustain that growth over 2 decades, and only a handful of countries and special administrative regions, in Hong Kong, and then there's Taiwan, only a small number of countries achieved 5% growth over 4 decades from the less developed world. And so that excludes Japan and Germany, for instance. And he says that the story of economic growth is really more China's story. But even this perhaps is less secure than it once was. He suggests that the challenge for China is that it has passed the Lewis turning point, and the Lewis turning point is the threshold of when an impoverished country no longer has a reserve army of labor from the rural areas available to it to keep labor prices down. And so China's labor is going to demand higher rates, and it's going to cause a shift of sorts of some industry to other countries such as Vietnam. Perhaps this point, though dated, maybe it's also somewhat true today when you consider that at a time when most of the West is experiencing inflation, China was actually experiencing deflation, where the value of the currency drops and relative to other currencies, and the prices of goods and services notably declined into the negative digits, suggesting anemic aggregate demand within markets. But he does pose some really powerful points, I think, that I hope I can leave you thinking about for the end of this lecture, such as, do they have that much in common? Do the BRICS countries have much in common aside from some vague reservations about the nature of world order and the legitimacy of an American-dominated world order? But is that basic principle, is that enough to sustain BRICS as a loose club that seemingly is on the rise and growing to include more and more countries? Perhaps eventually, while at one point it was a shadow to the G7, is it really on the verge of being a shadow to the G20, bound together perhaps by the malaise of poor development around the world and the malaise of the hypocrisies and contradictions of the Western international order? Okay, so that's it for this one. And our next set of readings and lecture is going to be thinking about development and climate change and the idea from the Brundtland Commission of sustainable development. Have a good one, folks. Take care all.